We heard it before we saw it, a wet, leathern agitation above the thatch, as of some great sail shaken out in a wind that never touched our faces. The lantern flame flattened sideways, though the air lay still and heavy with the reek of coconut oil and fear. Something scraped along the rafters, low and deliberate, and the donkey outside ceased braying mid-cry, as if a hand had closed upon its throat. Men have pressed me, over years and whiskies, to set down what occurred upon Pemba and Zanzibar in that season of 1971. I do so now with misgiving, yet if you would hear such accounts again, lend your approval, mark your interest, and set your thoughts upon the matter in a note below, that I may know whose company I keep in memory. To understand what we encountered, I must return to the beginning, before the wings in the rafters and the silenced donkey, to the more orderly world in which I still believed that every sound possessed a natural author, and that the dark of Africa held no more mysteries than those which a lantern and a notebook might dispel. It began in June of 1971 in Zanzibar town, when the rains had spent themselves and the air clung close to the skin. I had been seconded from the Royal Geographical Society to assist in a small ethnographic survey commissioned by the University College of Dar es Salaam. Our purpose, on paper, was the documentation of coastal folklore regarding nocturnal visitations and so-called night terrors, then troubling the isles of Unguja and Pemba. The newspapers had used another word, Popobawa. I confess that at the time I treated the matter as an interesting superstition, a convenient vessel into which the anxieties of a newly independent nation might be poured. I had read of the earlier panic in 1965, when men had slept in the open for fear of a flying assailant that slipped beneath doors and through shutters. Such things had always seemed to me, from the comfort of London, as curious footnotes to the great political rearrangements of the age. We were 4 in our party. There was Henderson, a lean Scotsman and lecturer in anthropology, whose Swahili far surpassed my own halting efforts. There was Miss Margaret Lane, nominally a linguist, but in truth the keenest observer among us, who had already spent 2 years collecting oral histories along the coast. Our 4th was a Zanzibari civil servant assigned as liaison, one Salim bin Juma, who had the air of a man wishing to be elsewhere, yet too dutiful to abscond. We embarked from Dar es Salaam aboard the Azizi, a small coastal steamer that smelt of diesel and dried fish, and reached Zanzibar town on the 12th of June. The harbour lay quiet beneath a faded sky, dhows at anchor with their lateen sails furled like folded wings. I remember thinking, with some private amusement, of all the phantom wings we were meant to catalogue. Our equipment was modest and of the period. 2 portable tape recorders, each the size of a valise and hungry for batteries. A pair of Rolleiflex cameras, notebooks, a Brunton compass, a battered theodolite that Henderson insisted upon bringing, though we were not there for mapping, and a crate of kerosene lanterns with spare mantles. We carried a 303 Lee Enfield rifle, more to satisfy the authorities than from any real expectation of use. The first days passed in the ordinary labours of our profession. We occupied 2 rooms in a whitewashed house off Gizenga Street, its wooden balconies eaten by salt and sun. Henderson and I spent our mornings in the district office, poring over reports of alleged attacks, men who claimed to have been sat upon in the night by a heavy presence, women who spoke of a winged shadow that whispered obscenities in their ears. The language of the reports was bureaucratic and embarrassed, as if the clerks had wished to wash their hands between each page. In the afternoons, we ventured into the alleys, guided by Salim, to conduct interviews. Margaret, with her patient smile and careful Swahili, was always the first to be trusted. She would sit upon a mat in some shaded courtyard while women ground cloves and cardamom and ask, in her soft English accent, when the trouble had begun, what had been heard, what had been seen. Often the answers were evasive. Men laughed too loudly, declaring that they feared nothing. Children stared at us with a solemnity that did not suit their years. It was upon the third evening, as the muezzin's call drifted over the town, that we first heard the sound which, in retrospect, I ought to have heeded more closely. We sat upon the flat roof of our lodging, the heat of the day radiating up through the stone. The sea lay black to the west, pricked with the small yellow lights of anchored dhows. Henderson produced a tin of tobacco from his pocket. "Lane," he said, offering it, "if you insist upon filling those tapes with tales of goblins, you must at least share in the vices of the men who tell them." She laughed and accepted, rolling a cigarette with quick, practiced fingers. I had not known she smoked. Salim declined, his gaze fixed upon the darkness beyond the harbour. "You do not approve of our errand," I said to him, not unkindly. He considered, then shrugged. "It is not for me to approve. The government wishes a report. You will write a report." "But you yourself," Margaret pressed gently. "Have you heard these stories before this year?" He hesitated, then nodded once. "I was a boy in '65. Men slept in the streets. The imams spoke of jinn. Then the army came, and the talk stopped. Now it begins again." Henderson exhaled a stream of smoke into the sultry air. "Mass hysteria," he said. "Political uncertainty, religious tension, the legacy of revolution. The mind seeks a shape for its fears, finds a bat-winged nuisance in the rafters, and names it Popobawa." Salim's jaw tightened. "You are a clever man, Bwana Henderson, but there are things that are not explained by your cleverness." Before Henderson could answer, the sound came, a thin, high keening, somewhere between a whistle and a wail, borne on no discernible breeze. It rose from the direction of Ngambo, the poorer quarter beyond the creek, and seemed to hang in the air, neither near nor far. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, then ceased. We felt silent. Even the street dogs below had stopped their barking. "A child," Henderson said at last, though his voice lacked conviction. "Some fool with a reed." Salim shook his head. "No child makes that sound." I recall that my rational mind, then robust, reached at once for prosaic explanations. A ship's whistle distorted by humidity. A radio. Some mechanical contrivance. I noted the direction with my compass, more from habit than concern. It pointed roughly northeast, toward the low, dark line of Pemba Island, which we had not yet visited. "Whatever it is," I said, "we shall sleep soundly enough, provided the mosquitoes are merciful." We laughed a little, the tension dissolving, and spoke then of home. It was one of those small human interludes which, in memory, acquire a painful clarity. Margaret spoke of her parents in Surrey, who believed that she was engaged in respectable academic work and would have been appalled by the courtyards and whispers. Henderson told us of his wife in Edinburgh, who had threatened to leave him if he accepted another post abroad, and yet had kissed him at the docks all the same. Salim, when pressed, admitted that he had a sister in Chak on Pemba, widowed in the troubles, whom he had not seen for 2 years. "You shall see her on this very journey," Margaret said. "We shall insist upon it." He smiled then, briefly, and the hardness left his eyes. It is that smile I recall most vividly when I think of all that followed. The following week, we crossed to Pemba aboard a smaller vessel, the Mwana Mkongwe, her hull scarred by reefs and time. The sea between the islands lay deceptively calm, a sheet of grey glass beneath a sky veiled by high cloud. We navigated by compass and dead reckoning, aided by the captain's intimate knowledge of current and shoal. There was no wireless aboard. Should anything befall us, we would be at the mercy of the sea and the local fishermen. We made landfall at Mkoani and proceeded by lorry along a rutted track through thick clove plantations, the air rich with their pungent sweetness. Children ran alongside, calling out to Salim, who replied with good-natured rebukes. The land here felt older, less touched by the recent upheavals of politics. Yet there was an unease, a watchfulness in the way doors closed as we passed. Our base upon Pemba was a government rest house above Chak Chak, a low white building with a corrugated iron roof and a view over the mangroves. From there, we made excursions to villages where reports of nocturnal visitations had been most frequent. The pattern, at first, appeared to confirm my preconceptions. Tales flared where rumour was strongest, where radios brought in breathless accounts from Zanzibar town, where imams spoke of jinn in their Friday sermons. Yet certain details resisted easy categorization. In Kiwani, 3 men described an identical sound preceding their affliction, a fluttering overhead as of heavy cloth, followed by a pressure upon the chest that left them unable to cry out. In Wait, a woman showed us deep gouges in the wooden lintel above her door, too high for any man to have reached without a ladder. In each case, the victims insisted that the assailant had spoken in a harsh, rasping whisper, promising to return if they failed to tell others of its presence. "Some cunning fellow," Henderson suggested, "moves from village to village, playing upon fear. A prankster, perhaps, or a political agitator with a talent for theatrics." Margaret frowned. "And the gouges? A tool, a hook. We shall find it yet." I clung to such explanations, though they grew thinner with each account we recorded. The tape reels filled with voices thick with dread, with the soft clatter of beads as if fingers worried at rosaries, with the occasional distant cry of some nocturnal bird whose call I could not place. It was during our second week on Pemba that the absences began. We had grown accustomed to the night sounds of the island, the chirr of insects, the occasional bark of a dog, the lowing of cattle, the mutter of voices carrying from distant huts. One night, as we lay in our narrow beds beneath mosquito nets, I woke to a silence so complete that it seemed a positive presence pressing against the eardrums. The usual chorus had ceased. Even the wind in the palms had stilled. I lay there, heart beating too fast, listening to the absence. After perhaps a minute, there came a faint rustle upon the roof, as of something large settling its weight upon the corrugated iron. The bed frame trembled slightly. A shadow crossed the thin line of light beneath the door, though there was no lantern burning in the corridor. I told myself it was a palm frond, a stray goat, some trick of moonlight. When the sounds of the night resumed, they did so all at once, as if some invisible hand had lifted from the island. In the morning, I mentioned the incident, half expecting mockery. "I heard it also," Margaret said quietly, stirring her tea. "The stillness, then something upon the roof. I thought perhaps I had dreamt it." Salim, who had been staring into his cup, looked up sharply. "You must not speak of such things at breakfast," he said. "It is bad luck." Henderson snorted. "Bad digestion, more like. You ate too much pilau lane." Yet he avoided my eye. The evidence, if such it could be called, continued to accumulate. We found tracks in the red earth outside a hut in Tumbe, a series of impressions like those of a large bird, yet too far apart for any known species, and terminating abruptly in the middle of an open yard, as if the creature had taken flight without a run. We photographed them, measured the span between, and argued over their origin. "A hoax," I said. "They have cut a pattern into a plank and stamped it." Margaret knelt, tracing the edges of one print with a gloved finger. "If so, they have gone to great trouble, and for no visible gain. There is no money in frightening us." Salim would not approach the tracks at all. He stood at a distance, mutterings under his breath. "What is it you say?" I asked. "Verses," he replied, and would elaborate no further. Each anomaly, considered alone, might have been dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that my mind resisted. I found myself waking in the small hours to listen for that oppressive silence, that weight upon the roof. My rational explanations grew strained, the scaffolding of skepticism creaking under the load. The micro-shock, as I have come to think of it, occurred upon our 12th night on Pemba, when Henderson and I sat in the rest house parlour, cataloguing the day's interviews by the light of a kerosene lantern. Margaret had retired early, complaining of a headache. Salim had gone to visit his sister in the town below, promising to return before midnight. The lantern hissed softly, throwing a yellow circle upon the table. Outside, the usual chorus of frogs and insects rasped and buzzed. Henderson bent over his notebook, his pen scratching. Without warning, the tape recorder upon the sideboard sprang to life. The reels began to turn, the machine emitting its familiar whir, though I had not touched it. The power cable lay coiled neatly beside it, unplugged. The indicator lamp, which ought to have glowed red when current flowed, remained dark. We stared, pens frozen. From the speaker issued a sound I knew at once, though I had hoped never to hear it so near. That thin, high keening we had first heard upon the roof in Zanzibar town, now rendered metallic and yet unmistakable. It rose, hovered, and cut off with a soft click, as if a finger had been lifted from a button. "Enough," Henderson said hoarsely, and crossed the room in 2 strides. He seized the machine and wrenched open its lid. The reels slowed and stopped. There was no tape threaded between them. We sat then in a silence broken only by the pounding of our own hearts. "There is some explanation," I said at last, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. "A mechanical fault, residual charge in the capacitors. The sound perhaps was from another reel, another day that we have misremembered." Henderson looked at me, his face drawn. "Do you believe that?" I opened my mouth and found no answer. Salam returned an hour later to find us still at the table, the tape recorder lying open like a dissected animal. When we told him what had occurred, he went very pale. "It is not wise," he said, "to bring such machines into these matters. They hear." From that night, the atmosphere among us altered. Our camaraderie frayed. Henderson, who had been the loudest in his skepticism, grew short-tempered, snapping at small errors. Margaret became withdrawn, her questions in interviews more perfunctory, as if she wished to be done and away. Salim spent more time in the mosque, returning with eyes reddened from lack of sleep. we began to quarrel over interpretations. Where I still sought natural causes, however unlikely, the others admitted, if only in private, that something beyond our understanding might be at work. The word Popobawa, which I had once spoken with a smile, now lodged in my throat. Our most detailed account came from a fisherman in a village called Mikiweni, upon the northern tip of Pemba. He was a wiry man of perhaps 50, with scarred hands and eyes that seldom met ours. He agreed to speak only in the presence of the village imam, who sat at his side, fingers moving over his beads. The fisherman described waking in the night to a smell of musk and rot, as if something long dead had been dragged into his hut. He had heard a heavy flapping above him, and then a weight upon his chest that drove the breath from his lungs. A voice, close to his ear, had whispered in a tongue he did not know, yet whose meaning he somehow understood. That he must speak of what had occurred, or the visits would continue. "It pressed upon me," he said, his own voice shaking, "as a man presses upon a woman. I could not move. I could not cry out. Only when the call to prayer sounded did it release me, and I saw, as it left, a shadow upon the wall, with wings that touched both corners of the room." Margaret's hand tightened upon her pen. Henderson shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. "You had been drinking," he suggested, not unkindly. "Palm wine. Perhaps you dreamt." The fisherman's gaze snapped up, full of sudden anger. "I do not drink," he said. "I am a Muslim. I know the difference between a dream and a thing that crushes your ribs." We left Mikiweni subdued. On the path back to our lorry, Margaret said quietly, "You heard him. The detail, the consistency. There is a pattern here that is not merely hysteria." "Patterns can form from coincidence," I replied. "The human mind is a factory of phantoms." She stopped, looking at me with something like pity. "And what of the tape recorder, Edward? Did your factory produce that as well?" I had no answer. The days wore on. Our notebooks filled. The nights grew longer. The peak of our encounter, and the moment to which all these signs had been leading, came in the village of Mjini Ole, upon the western coast of Pemba, where reports had been most recent and most violent. We arrived there on the 3rd of July, the air heavy with the promise of another storm that never quite broke. The village elders received us with a mixture of courtesy and apprehension. They had heard of our work. Some wished to speak. Others muttered darkly that we would only anger the thing. We arranged to sleep in a small concrete house near the edge of the village, its roof of corrugated iron and its single room divided by a curtain. Our intention was to remain for 3 nights, to observe, to reassure, to show by our presence that there was nothing to fear. I recall the confidence with which we set up our cots, our lanterns, our instruments, as if the mere paraphernalia of science could ward off whatever haunted these people. On the first night, nothing occurred. We lay awake, listening to the familiar chorus of frogs and insects, the occasional distant bark of a dog. I almost convinced myself that the worst was behind us, that the tape recorder, the tracks, the silences had been an unfortunate confluence of chance and suggestion. On the second night, the air grew so still that the lantern flame stood upright as a needle. The smell of the sea, usually present as a faint tang, vanished, replaced by a dry, chalky odor that made the throat itch. Salim recited verses softly behind the curtain. Margaret's breathing in the cot beside mine was shallow and quick. Somewhere outside, a donkey began to bray, a raw, tearing sound that set my teeth on edge. It went on and on until it broke off abruptly, as if cut by a knife. Then the night fell into that absolute silence I had come to dread. I lay rigid beneath my mosquito net, every sense straining. I felt, rather than heard, a pressure in the air, as if the atmosphere within the hut had thickened. The temperature dropped. The sweat upon my skin cooled to a clammy film. The hairs upon my arms rose. Above us, upon the iron roof, there came a slow, deliberate scraping, as of claws or rough pads drawn along the metal. The sound moved from one end of the hut to the other, paused, then returned. The lantern, which I had left burning low upon the crate between our cots, flickered though no breeze touched it. "Do you hear it?" Margaret whispered. "Yes," I replied, though my voice was scarcely more than breath. The scraping ceased. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, with a soft, yielding creak, as of weight applied to old wood, the rafters above us sagged. The lantern flame flattened sideways, pressed almost horizontal by some invisible force. The air filled with a smell I can only describe as a mixture of bat guano, wet leather, and something else, something sweet and corrupt, like fruit left too long in the sun. I turned my head very slowly toward the door. Beneath it, the line of light from the dying lantern narrowed, as if a shadow had fallen across the threshold from without. The curtain that divided our room from Salim's stirred, though the air remained still. Then came the sound that has never left me, a wet, leathern agitation, as of great wings being unfurled in too small a space, the membranes catching upon rough surfaces, the bones within them creaking. Something moved along the rafters, its weight discernible in the groan of wood and the fine dust that sifted down upon my face. I dared not move to wipe it away. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently that I wondered, in a detached way, if the thing above could hear it. From the other side of the curtain, Salim began to pray aloud, his voice high and thin. Henderson, somewhere beyond, muttered an oath. "Do not speak," Margaret hissed. "Do not give it your name." Whether she spoke from some local belief she had absorbed or from her own terror, I do not know. I lay there, every muscle locked, and listened. The weight shifted. A dark mass descended between the rafters and the lantern, eclipsing the feeble light. I saw, not directly, but as a silhouette upon the wall, something that might have been a hunched torso, disproportionately broad, from which sprang two vast, ragged wings that brushed the corners of the room. Where a head might have been, there was only a suggestion of a snout or beak, elongated and hooked. The shadow bent, as if peering down at us. A pressure settled upon my chest, though nothing touched me. It was as if the air itself had thickened into a hand that pressed me into the mattress. I tried to draw breath and found that I could take only shallow sips. Panic flared, bright and useless. Then, close to my ear, though no mouth was near, there came a voice. It was not in English, nor in Swahili, nor in any tongue I have since recognized. It was a rasping, guttural whisper that seemed to bypass the usual channels of hearing and lodge directly in the mind. Yet I understood its intent. "You will speak of me," it said. "You will tell them. If you do not, I shall return." The pressure increased. Spots of light danced before my eyes. I felt, with a horrid intimacy, the beat of some enormous heart above me, slow and steady, like the pumping of a bellows. From the other side of the curtain came a strangled cry. There was a thump, as of a body striking the floor. Margaret's hand groped blindly across the space between our cots and found mine. Her fingers were ice cold. The lantern went out. In that total darkness, the presence above us seemed to swell, to fill every inch of space. The smell grew overpowering, invading the sinuses, coating the tongue. I thought, with a clarity that astonishes me still, that this was how a moth must feel beneath the paw of a cat, pinned and helpless. Then, as suddenly as it had descended, the pressure lifted. The air rushed back into my lungs with a painful whoop. The weight upon the rafters withdrew, the wood creaking in relief. There was a final, heavy beat of those unseen wings, a rush of displaced air that stirred the nets. The smell receded, leaving only the familiar sense of sweat and kerosene. Outside, a dog began to bark, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The chorus of insects resumed. I lay gasping in the dark, Margaret's hand still gripping mine. No one spoke. The silence among us was as thick as the one that had preceded the visitation, but of a different quality, full of shame and incredulity. At last, Henderson struck a match with shaking fingers and lit the lantern. Its flame guttered, then steadied, casting a sickly light over the room. Dust lay upon our blankets in a fine film. The rafters above bore fresh scratches, parallel and deep, scoring the old wood. The curtain had been torn from its hook in one place, hanging at an angle. We found Salim upon the floor of his half of the room, curled upon his side like a child. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, his lips moving soundlessly. When we touched him, he flinched as if burned. "Salim," Margaret said softly, "can you hear me?" He blinked, focused upon her with difficulty, and then began to weep in great, racking sobs that shook his thin frame. "It spoke," he managed between gasps. "It spoke my name." We did not sleep again that night. We sat upon our cots, the lantern between us speaking little. Each of us, I think, grappled with the impossibility of what we had experienced, trying to fit it into the familiar frameworks of nightmare, hysteria, shared delusion. Yet the scratches upon the rafters, the dust upon our blankets, the bruises that would later appear upon our chests where no hand had touched, resisted such convenient categorization. With the dawn came decisions. The immediate aftermath was marked by a brittle, practical urgency. Henderson, his face grey, announced that we would cut short our stay in Mjini Ol and return at once to Chake Chak and thence to Zanzibar town. He did not speak of abandoning the expedition, but the word hung unspoken between us. "We have what we came for," he said, his voice rough. "More than enough. There is no need to court further incidents." Salim refused to enter another house in the village. He waited by the lorry, arms wrapped about himself, while we made our farewells to the elders. Their expressions held a grim satisfaction, as if our shaken demeanor confirmed what they had long known. "You have seen," the Imam said quietly to me. "Now you will write, but take care what you write. There are ears everywhere." On the road back to Chake Chak, the landscape seemed altered, though of course it was the same red earth, the same clove trees, the same scattered goats. Yet every shadow beneath a palm frond, every dark opening in the foliage, suggested wings half furled, eyes watching. The sky pressed low, a white, unbroken sheet. Our conversations, once lively, dwindled. When we spoke, it was of practicalities, ship schedules, accommodation, the disposition of our notes and tapes. No one mentioned the thing upon the roof. It lay between us like a corpse we dared not acknowledge. That night in the rest house, The silence among us was almost as oppressive as the one that had preceded the visitation. Margaret sat with her notebook open upon her lap, pen unmoving. Henderson poured himself more whiskey than was his habit and drank it without tasting. Salim sat in a corner, his back to the wall, eyes fixed upon the door. "We must decide," Henderson said at last, "what we shall say in our official report." The word official fell into the room like a stone. "You mean," I said slowly, "what we shall omit." He met my gaze. "You are not a fool, Edward. Nor am I. Nor is Miss Lane. We know what we experienced. We know also what will be made of it in London, in Dar es Salaam. We are here at the invitation of governments, of institutions that do not look kindly upon tales of flying devils." Margaret closed her notebook. "If we do not speak of it," she said, "we become complicit in the very silence that gives this thing its power." "Do you propose," Henderson asked, a trace of his old sarcasm returning, "that we submit to the Royal Geographical Society a paper entitled On the Manifestation of a Bat-Winged Entity in a Government Rest House upon Pemba Island? I assure you, it would be the end of all our careers." "And yet," I said, "if we reduce this to a matter of mass hysteria and misperception, we lie." "We interpret," he countered. "That is our work. We are not stenographers for the supernatural." Salim, who had been silent, spoke then. "You have been warned," he said. "It told you to speak, but it did not say to whom." We left Pemba 2 days later aboard a small dhow, the Mzee Ali, its patched sail bellied by a reluctant wind. The crossing was rougher than before. A squall blew up from the southeast, driving grey sheets of rain across the deck. The dhow pitched and rolled, its timbers groaning. I clung to the gunwale, my stomach heaving, and thought not of drowning, but of wings struggling in a storm, of something vast and leathern buffeted above the waves. In Zanzibar town, the contrast between the clamour of the harbour and the quiet terror of Pemba struck me with almost physical force. Men shouted, bargained, laughed. The smell of spices and diesel and fish filled the air. Life went on, heedless of the thing that had crouched above our cots. We took rooms once more in the whitewashed house off Gizenga Street. The familiar creak of its stairs, the rattle of its shutters, ought to have been comforting. Instead, every sound seemed laden with potential menace. The process of composing our official account began at once. Henderson and I sat at the same table where, weeks before, we had heard the first distant keening and drafted a report for the University College and the Ministry of Information. We wrote of social anxiety, of post-revolutionary trauma, of the role of rumour and religious discourse in shaping collective experience. We cited case studies, quoted interviews, carefully selected, and appended recommendations for public education campaigns. Nowhere did we mention the tape recorder that had played without power. Nowhere did we describe the weight upon our chests, the voice in our ears, the scratches upon the rafters. Margaret read our draft in silence, her face expressionless. When she finished, she laid the pages upon the table and said, "It is elegant, it is coherent, it is also, in the most important respect, false." Henderson rubbed his eyes. "What would you have us do, Lane? March into the ministry and declare that we have been sat upon by a demon? They would send us to a doctor, not a publisher." She looked at me. "And you, Edward? Will you sign your name to this?" I hesitated, pen poised above the page. In that moment I thought of the fisherman in Mishiweni, of the woman in Vete, of the children who had watched us with solemn eyes. I thought of the whisper in the dark. "You will speak of me." "I will sign," I said at last, the words tasting of ash. "But I shall also keep my own notes, for myself." "And for whom else?" she asked. "For whoever may one day wish to hear the truth," I replied, though I did not then know who that might be. We presented our report to the permanent secretary at the ministry, a portly man in a well-cut suit who listened with polite impatience. When we had finished, he leafed through the pages, nodding at the appropriate phrases. "Very good," he said. "Very modern. You say this Popobawa is what is the term, projection of social anxiety?" "In essence," Henderson replied, "a confluence of factors." "Excellent," the secretary interrupted. "We shall inform the press that there is nothing to fear, that the matter is being studied by experts." He smiled broadly. "You see, my friends, our young nation is not backward. We have scholars. We have reports." Outside his office in the corridor, a junior clerk who had been present during our presentation approached me. "Bwana," he said softly, glancing about to ensure we were unobserved. "My cousin on Pemba says that last week, in his village, a man was found in the morning with his arm broken and his eyes wrong. He says the man will not sleep indoors now. He says the thing came to him." I looked at the clerk, at his earnest, frightened face, and felt the weight of the pages in my briefcase. "Your cousin should sleep where he feels safest," I said, "and he should not be ashamed to speak of what he has experienced." The clerk studied me for a moment, as if weighing my words, then nodded and slipped away. We left Zanzibar soon after, returning to Dar es Salaam, and thence, in time, to our respective homes. On the ship to Mombasa, as the coastline receded into a hazy line, Henderson stood beside me at the rail. "We shall not speak of that night again," he said, his eyes on the water. "Not in any official capacity. Do you understand?" "I understand," I replied. "But I do not agree." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You are a braver man than I, or a greater fool." Margaret joined us then, her coat pulled tight against the sea breeze. "I have written to a colleague in Nairobi," she said, "an ethnographer who will be less concerned with what the ministry wishes to hear. Perhaps there is a way to tell this story obliquely, through the words of those we interviewed." "And through our own?" I asked. She met my gaze. "Perhaps, in time." Years passed. Life, as it does, overlaid those weeks on Pemba with other concerns. Lectures given, papers published, minor honors accrued. Yet the experience did not recede as other memories do. It remained, sharp and undimmed, like a shard of glass beneath the skin that the body cannot expel. The first haunting came not in sleep, but in the most prosaic of settings. I was in my rooms in Bloomsbury one autumn evening in 1975, working by the light of a desk lamp. Rain tapped upon the window panes. The muffled rumble of London traffic formed a distant, comforting hum. I had left the wireless off. I rose to make tea. As I crossed the room, the small tape recorder upon my sideboard, a later model than the one we had carried to Pemba, yet similar in principle, clicked. The reels began to turn. I froze, cup in hand. The machine was plugged in, as I had been transcribing interviews earlier, but I had not touched it. The indicator lamp glowed red. From the speaker issued, not the voice of the elderly Kenyan woman whose recollections I had been editing, but a faint, high keening, stretched and distorted by the poor fidelity, yet unmistakable. The hairs upon my arms rose. The room seemed to contract. I I crossed the floor and pressed the stop button with perhaps more force than was necessary. The sound cut off. The reels slowed, then halted. For a long moment, I stood there, listening to the pounding of my own heart. Rational explanations presented themselves. A mechanical fault, a misaligned switch, a fragment of an old recording that had somehow remained on the tape. I clung to them as a drowning man clings to driftwood. Yet that night, when I lay in bed, the rain upon the windows took on a new timbre. In the intervals between gusts, I fancied I heard, far above the rooftops of London, a leathern agitation, a vast, patient circling. The second haunting was more direct. In 1978, at a conference in Edinburgh, I encountered Henderson for the first time since our return from East Africa. He had grown heavier, his hair thinner, his manner more brusque. Yet when he saw me across the crowded reception room, his face altered, and for a moment I glimpsed the man who had stood rigid beneath the sagging rafters of Mjini Ole. We found a quiet corner, away from the clink of glasses and the murmur of academic gossip. Outside, the Scottish dusk pressed against the windows, grey and damp. "You have not spoken of it," he said without preamble. "Nor have you," I replied. He gave a tight smile. "I married again, took a post in Canada for a time, tried to forget. It has not entirely worked." "Have you heard anything?" I asked, and hated the tremor in my voice. He hesitated, then nodded. "Once, in Vancouver, a stormy night. I woke to that silence, you remember it? And then to a weight upon my chest. I told myself it was a night terror. The doctors have a term for it now, sleep paralysis. They say it is common. And you believe them?" He looked at me, his eyes bloodshot. "I want to. I want very much to." We fell silent. The noise of the reception washed around us, unreal. "Lane wrote to me last year," he said at length. "She's in Nairobi still. She says the stories continue, new outbreaks, new panics. The name has spread inland, they say, to places that have never seen the sea. Popobawa upon the slopes of Kilimanjaro. Can you imagine?" I could. Too easily. "Will you go back?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, I have tempted fate enough for one lifetime." We parted with formal promises to correspond, which neither of us kept. Henderson died, I learned some years later, of a heart attack in his sleep. His widow, whom I met once at a memorial, said he had often complained of a heaviness upon his chest at night. "He would wake gasping," she said. "The doctors said it was anxiety. He took tablets. It did not help." I did not tell her of Pemba. My own life narrowed. I took fewer field assignments, preferring the ordered chaos of archives to the unpredictable dark of distant villages. Yet the experience followed me into lecture halls and libraries. When students asked, as they sometimes did, whether I believed in spirits, in jinn, in the supernatural, I gave them careful, measured answers about belief systems and cultural frameworks. I spoke of respecting local interpretations while maintaining critical distance. I did not speak of the smell of wet leather and rot, of dust sifting from rafters, of a voice that bypassed the ear. There were other, smaller hauntings. A sudden, unnatural silence in a London square as pigeons took flight all at once, leaving the air thick and expectant. A bat that flew in broad daylight in widening circles above a Nairobi street, its wingspan larger than any species I knew, before vanishing into a sky empty of clouds. The way certain shadows in my own modest flat seemed at times to possess a depth that did not correspond to any physical object. I read what I could. Papers on sleep paralysis, on hypnagogic hallucinations, on the cultural embedding of night terrors, accounts of the incubus and succubus in medieval Europe, of the old hag in Newfoundland, of the jinn in Islamic tradition. The parallels were striking. A weight upon the chest, a paralysis, a presence. The mind, it seemed, was predisposed to such experiences, dressing them in whatever garb local belief provided. This comforted me up to a point. Yet no paper I read, no theory I entertained, quite encompassed the totality of what had occurred in that hut on Pemba. The physical traces, the shared perception, the voice that had addressed us with such calculated intent. In 1982, in a moment of perhaps unwise resolve, I returned to Zanzibar. It had changed, of course. Tourism had begun to take root. New hotels rose along the seafront, their concrete incongruous among the old coral rag houses. Yet the alleys of Stone Town still twisted as they always had, and the sea still pressed its salt breath into every crack. I did not go to Pemba. Some lines, once drawn, are not easily crossed again. Instead, I sought out those who had been children during the panics of the 60s and 70s, now grown, to hear how the stories had evolved. The name Popobawa was everywhere, in whispers and in jokes, in the graffiti upon walls, in the muttered curses of men who had drunk too much. One evening, in a tea house near the harbour, I fell into conversation with a middle-aged man who, when he learned that I had been in Pemba in 1971, regarded me with a curious mixture of respect and pity. "You went into the villages," he said. "You slept in their houses. You are either very brave or very foolish, Mzee." "Perhaps both," I replied. "Tell me, do they still fear it as they did?" He shrugged. "Sometimes more, sometimes less. It comes in waves. People sleep outside in groups so that it will not come. Then, after some months, life returns to normal. Until the next time." "Has anyone seen it clearly?" I asked. "With their eyes, not in dreams?" He considered. "Some say yes. They say it is like a bat, but not a bat. Like a man, but not a man. They say it smells terrible. They say it speaks." He paused, then added, "They say also that it does not like those who do not believe in it." I thought of Henderson, of his heart hammering beneath an invisible weight. When I returned to my lodging that night, the ceiling fan turned lazily above my bed, stirring the heavy air. I lay awake, listening to the distant crash of waves upon the reef, to the occasional shout from the street below. At some point, I drifted into that grey borderland between waking and sleep. I woke to silence. The fan had stopped. The street noises had ceased. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. I lay very still, staring up at the dark disk of the fan. The air thickened, pressing upon my skin. The smell came then. Faint but unmistakable. Wet leather, musk, a hint of rot. My heart began to race. I felt the first feather-light suggestion of weight upon my chest. "No," I said aloud, surprising myself. My voice sounded small in the stillness. "You have no claim upon me. I have spoken of you. I have written. I have not kept your secret." The weight paused. The smell intensified, as if some unseen presence leaned closer. "You have not told them all," the whisper came, not in my ear, but in my mind. "You have hidden. You have softened. You have wrapped me in your clever words." Perhaps it was the years that lay between that night on Pemba and this one, the accretion of ordinary disappointments and small cowardices that gave me a certain weary courage. "I am an old man," I said, though I was not yet as old as I am now. "I have done what I could. If you wish to visit those who have made use of your name for gain, who have laughed while others trembled seek them. I am no longer of consequence. There was a long, terrible moment in which nothing moved, in which I felt myself balanced upon the edge of something vast and unfathomable. Then, slowly, the pressure lessened. The smell receded. Through the open window came the distant, blessedly mundane sound of a motorbike passing along the seafront, its engine whining. The fan above me shuddered, then resumed its lazy rotation. I lay there, shaking, until dawn. In the years since, I have come to accept that I shall never fully understand what we encountered upon Pemba. I have turned the experience over in my mind from every angle, like a stone in the hand, seeking fissures into which reason might be wedged. I have found some cultural frameworks, psychological predispositions, the suggestibility of exhausted minds in unfamiliar environments. Yet there remains at the core a hardness that resists all such tools. Perhaps Popobawa is a thought form, conjured and sustained by collective fear, yet capable, in some fashion we do not yet grasp, of exerting pressure upon the physical world. Perhaps it is an old thing, older than Islam or the Swahili tongue, that has worn many names and shapes along that coast, now clothed in the imagery of bats and devils brought by sailors and missionaries. Perhaps it is nothing more than the dark within ourselves, given wings by the stories we tell. I do not know. I have come, in my old age, to be at peace with that not knowing. There are limits to what our instruments, our measurements, our neat reports can encompass. The world is larger than our categories. What disturbs me still, more than the wings or the weight or the whisper, is a smaller, more intimate detail. The way the dust fell from the rafters that night in Gini Ole, in a fine, steady sift, as if something immense and patient had been waiting there for a very long time, and had only just now chosen to move. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city around me sleeps, and even the traffic has stilled, I lie awake and feel the air upon my face. If it is very still, if the silence has that particular thickness I remember from Pemba, I fancy I can hear, far above the ceiling and the roof and the clouds, a slow, leathern stirring, as of wings testing themselves in the dark, unhurried, unwatched, and in no doubt that, when it chooses to descend again, there will always be someone, somewhere, listening.